I am very pleased to have joining me for this episode of the podcast somebody I respect an awful lot for his dedication to matters around the business of football. Known to many as the Esk, he is the host of the Everton Business Matters podcast, the Talking the Blues podcast, and his newer the Esk Podcasts. Paul, I'd just like to say I'm glad we finally got round to this, and thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Max. That's sort of a very nice thing to say about me. I obviously ran out of names with my last series of podcasts. So I need somebody to help me on the marketing front. But there's so much to talk about, and thankfully, a lot of people are prepared to listen, as I'm sure they listen to your podcast as well. So there's a massive market for fan-led content, and especially content that perhaps is slightly different from much of the rest. And I think you accommodate that with your series of podcasts and the people that you speak to. And I try to do the same, albeit, on a fairly narrow focus of Everton.
Yeah, during these strange times that we're living in, as you say, there most definitely is a demand for a different take and a different perspective in regards to podcasts and content. And I think that's probably something that we're going to touch on later on. But firstly, before embracing the usual lines of critical thinking, I'd just like to ask about your own sort of subjective experiences when it comes to football. One of the major reasons as to why I do these podcasts is growing up, I had an extremely close relationship with my granddad, who played for Everton during the 50s, and we literally, when I was younger, we'd sit there, and podcasts weren't exactly a thing then, but we'd sit for hours on end just talking about sports, footballs, Everton and otherwise. Which again, as I say, I think this really cultivated my appetite to hearing people's own experiences and preferences within football. I think we found with the latest news that Everton's season ticket renewals for the 2021 season has a 98% renewal rate that Evertonians identify very strongly with their football, and it means an awful lot to them. So, as I said before, for someone who dedicates an awful lot of their time to the sport, what is it and why does the sport mean so much to you?
But funnily enough, there's quite strong parallels between what you've just explained in terms of why you're an Evertonian and why I am. Except mine goes back one generation further than that. So my great-grandfather played for Everton, played in the first game at Goodison actually in 1892, and was with the club for many years. Now, obviously, I never met my great-granddad because he died before I was born. But one of his sons was obviously my granddad, and he was quite a remarkable character actually. He was a docker, so it's very typical Liverpool working man, but absolutely Everton mad, completely and utter. Well, he was sports mad. He had three great interests in life. He enjoyed his work, he enjoyed his garden, and he enjoyed sports. His family didn't feature at all in anything that he really enjoyed, to be honest. And so he was an absolute fanatic. But also beyond that, he was a great recorder of matches and things that went on. So he used to buy 2 programs every game, and in one program he used to write his notes in, and the other program he used to keep for pristine condition. And when he got home, he used to write the notes that he'd written in the program. He used to write into a series of ledgers, and he did that religiously. And so I've got all those as a record. But more than that, it was the tales that he used to tell, because they used to go with a gang of lads from work, and one week they'd go to Goodison and one week they'd go to Anfield. The only away games they ever went to were games at United or Bolton, games that sort of maybe less than an hour away on the train, because most of those people worked on a Saturday anyway, so they worked up till lunchtime, till midday on a Saturday, and so they only had 3 hours to get to a game. And at least a couple of those 3 hours was involved drinking in some pub in the city centre. So, but they went from one weekend they'd go to Goodison, one weekend they'd go to Anfield, and it was a real mix. Some of them were Evertonians, some of them were Liverpool supporters. But it was his love for the game and his passion for the game that gave me my passion. And I've retained my passion for Everton. I'm not sure I've necessarily retained my passion for the game, partly because I've lived away from Liverpool for so many years. But also, I actually, it's a strange saying this, I don't think the game is as good as it used to be. Now that may be a function of me just being older and being more cynical, or just seeing it through different eyes, or it may actually be the reality. But I don't really like the modern game, and I find it incredibly frustrating to watch. Not only because of what happens to Everton on the pitch, just everything that goes on the pitch, I find incredibly frustrating. And I know if my granddad was here, he was far less polite than I am, so he just called a spade, and he was straight out with it. He would hate this. He would hate this game, but hey, we are where we are.
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting. And
yeah, but also, I love playing football as well. So played for the school, played for the local Sunday league team and stuff. So I mean, I did love football, and I still love Everton, although I'm not sure I still love football, if you understand me.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a sentiment that I can share as well. In terms of your own personal experiences, are there any away trips, games that you've attended, or significant players that really impacted and cultivated your love for the sport?
Oof. If you were to ask, if it was like a desert island discs of games that you've been to, and been to hundreds over the years, not so many in recent years, but hundreds over the years. The one game that I will always refer back to is the 1984 Cup final.
Watford.
Not because it was a great game. It wasn't. It wasn't particularly a great game. Just that moment when that moment before Kevin Ratcliffe lifted the FA Cup. If I had to boil down my whole Everton experience, it would be that singular moment just before he lifted the cup, when all of the frustration of having been a teenager in the 70s, when Liverpool were winning everything and we were winning nothing, all that sort of pent up anticipation of what would it be like when we eventually won a trophy, just boiled down to that single moment just before Ratcliffe lifted the cup. There seemed to be like a pause. It seems to be almost like time stood still for a few seconds. And the Everton end. I mean, Everton, that game, we probably had like 70% of Wembley. There was just Evertonians everywhere. But the Everton end, it just went quiet just for a few seconds, before he, and it was like, go on. And when he actually lifted the cup, then obviously there was just complete bedlam everywhere. But that to me is singularly the most the standout moment of, and obviously many other great times as well. Winning the league for the second time, Norwich away, was a fantastic experience. Some of the semi-finals at Villa Park, the semi-final in '89 for very different reasons. The journey home was a big thing. '95 was a big thing at Wembley again. Unfortunately, there haven't been many since '95. There've been one or two. The first minutes of they all seem to focus around cup finals. The first minutes of the cup final against Chelsea was fantastic, but then we just knew that we scored too early and we were going to lose. Wow, it's a good question actually. Sort of, what games do you remember? The '84 Cup final definitely for me was the sort of the real thing. And funny enough, also the year before the Milk Cup final against Liverpool, when it was 0-0, and everybody was singing Merseyside, Merseyside. The one thing I remember about that is as the Evertonians were leaving Wembley, we all started singing "We'll be back, we'll be back, we'll be back,"
Yeah.
which is like an extraordinary thing to do at the time, because we weren't really a a club that was used to going to Wembley, and obviously we went to Wembley many, many times over the next few years. But I remember that point as well, that we were. It was like the sort of the turning point. We knew that we were going to go back.
Yeah, I can only imagine what that was like. I can't exactly remember off the top of my head, but I think it was the '87 Charity Shield final,
Yeah.
which we won, and it was something absolutely ridiculous. The amounts of trips to Wembley that we'd made in that duration of time, and as you say, for someone like myself, 21 years of age, unfortunately, haven't experienced any silverware, but for a fact, we were the first Merseyside club to play at the new Wembley, and in fairness, we'd made several trips to Wembley over the couple of years, and again, I'm sure it's something when we discuss Everton, we'll talk about it. But it's just that killer instinct, isn't it? It's being able to push yourself over the line, and get to it. But before we touch on Everton, the 1920 season has been, in my memory, the longest season that I can recall, and if I'm not wrong, it's quite possibly the longest season in English football history. Given the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the industry, and of course them lot over Stanley Park winning the league. I was just wondering, obviously, as I say, you dedicate a lot of your time to written work and podcasts. What have been your main observations and conclusions from this very bizarre season?
I think football has damaged itself somewhat. I listened to Richard Masters at the last select committee that he attended in the Houses of Parliament, and this was after Project Restart started again, and he was sort of almost in a self-congratulatory mode about how football had led sport out of lockdown. And I was really uncomfortable with that, because I think, actually, as I say, I think in the long term football has damaged itself. I think we don't know, obviously, whether a second wave is going to come, how much of the current uptick continues. Does it evolve into full blown second wave over the winter, whatever? But one of the big concerns I had about football coming back too early was that it was part of a normalization program by the government. And I'm not being political here. I'm just saying it as I see it. And football was complicit in that normalization. The idea that society was getting back to normal much before it should have been from a public health and safety point of view. And I just think I think two things. I think football was weak to play a part in that, and not to sort of stand firmer than that. And I think the reason why football did what it did in getting, well, the Premier League did what it did, let's be more precise, in getting back, is because of the very poor relationships it actually has with its commercial sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
If they had a truly symbiotic relationship, i.e., where both parties benefit from their involvement with each other, then the stance that the broadcasters, particularly the domestic broadcasters, took in terms of, well, if you don't start the season again, the financial penalties are going to be so huge that you're left with no option.
Mm-hmm.
That would never have occurred. And I think what happened is that the broadcasters, this was payback time by the broadcasters. The broadcasters were hurting because they had no content. I understand that entirely.
Yeah.
And as a result of having no content, a percentage of their subscribers obviously cancelled subscriptions, and obviously there was much reduced advertising revenue because they didn't have live content to show.
Yeah.
So I get that completely, and obviously that put pressure on their balance sheets in terms of their cash flow, put pressure on them. But I think that the broadcasters looked at the Premier League and said, we're going to get you back on this, because for years you've played one off against the other. There's never been a true partnership between Sky and the Premier League, BT and the Premier League, BBC and the Premier League, because they've always played each other one off the other. Now, I understand, how competitive tendering works, and the rights packages have always been a competitive tender, but I think that because the Football League, or the Premier League, extracted every single cent that they could out of the broadcasters consistently for years on years without that true partnership, that the broadcasters got their own back, and they forced the Premier League to create what can only be described as a substandard product, in order to fulfill some commercial obligations and to reduce the amount of rebate that they would have had to have paid.
Yeah, because I was going to say that they did initially. I think the Premier League had to pay around something like 36 million in rebates to broadcasters for every week that the Premier League extended beyond, I believe it was the 16th of July or something like a date in July. Every time that the week match day fixture extended beyond that certain date, then payments had to be made back to broadcasters, and I think that reinforces your point.
Yeah, well, actually, there was a start date, and if they were late on the start date, there was a penalty. I think you figured that you gave us correct, around about 36 million a week. But there was also, if they hadn't finished by the date that they finished, the contract would have been null and void, and they would have gone back to the point that they started with, the sort of 700 million cost to be split amongst the 20 clubs. So the broadcasters got the Premier League in a corner, and they bullied them into what they did. And I think that both in terms of a visual image, I didn't watch any Everton game at all because I was so against the restart.
You didn't miss much.
No, I think I made probably one of my better decisions over the years, actually. But the little bits that I saw, like on the BBC websites, whatever, the visual image was very poor. The stopping the game, I can understand for medical reasons why you'd stop the game and give people drinks playing in the middle of the summer. The 5 substitutes and the 9 substitutes on the bench, all of these sort of artificial things that crept into the game. Just to me, if you've got a really premium product, and the Premier League has always been sold as a premium product, the last thing that you do is you change it. It's a bit like when Coca-Cola in the 90s decided that, having done some sort of study of people's tastes, decided to change the original flavor of Coca-Cola. And of course, sales plummeted the day that they did it, and about 2 months later, they had to go back to the original. You don't mess around with something that's clearly working. And up to the pandemic, the Premier League, whether we like it or not, works because so many people watch it overseas, and it's been sold so successfully overseas. I just think that demonstrated a weakness in the organisation of the Premier League and the management of the Premier League. And of course, the clubs themselves, because of the way most clubs use the money that they receive, that they spend absolutely everything that they get, they were always going to look at what the short-term requirements were over the long-term requirements. And my fear is that next year, when the cycle starts again for tendering for 2022 to 2025, which is the next cycle, we're going to see a much reduced level of income coming from the broadcasters, and that's obviously going to, even the short period now has damaged football clubs, but even more so when we find that the next cycle is significantly less than the current.
Yeah, that's most definitely going to have an interesting impact on the industry, and as you say, the product as a whole in regards to broadcasting. And something that I did want to ask you about is that, I mean, you touched on better days and the fact that football was a completely different entity beforehand. And to me, I was always raised to believe that football clubs are a social hub of their community, and should always maintain, a significant presence in their local area, which again has obviously changed with globalization and the impact of broadcasting monies that has come in. But when you see Premier League football clubs, multi-million pound entities, organisations, furloughing people and making redundancies. Obviously, Liverpool received a huge amount of backlash for their initial announcement that they would furlough some of their staff, which they U-turned on. And there's the most recent news of Arsenal Football Club making 55 redundancies, which I thought was quite cheeky, as it was addressed in a press statement titled "A Message from Your Football Club." What is your take on the behaviour of football clubs during this pandemic?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I have some sympathy actually with the football clubs who looked at furloughing. I think if you accept that in order to attract the best talent in terms of footballers, it's such a competitive business that there's massive inflation in wages, and there's really very little that you can do about that. It is literally often the club that pays the highest gets the best players. There's nothing that clubs really can do about it, unless the industry says, okay, we're going to have a cap on salaries, and nobody can get paid more than 100,000 a week, or whatever the figure is. Even that's like a crazy figure.
Yeah.
There's nothing that they can do about wage inflation in terms of the players. Very little that they can do about that unless we do it collectively. So I think you have to put that to one side and say, okay, that just happens because if we want to be competitive next year, we're going to have to pay what the market takes. I think Arsenal were very ham-fisted in what they did, the way that they addressed it, as you say, a message from our football club. I think it's ham-fisted in terms of timing, because if you look at what's happened in recent weeks, they refinanced their bond issue, their debt, which has saved them millions of pounds. They won the FA Cup at the weekend, which generated £3 or £4 million in prize money from the FA Cup, but got them into Europe, which is probably worth a minimum 15 million if they even if they can just go through the group stages, up to 40 million if they win it. So I think the timing of it is really unfortunate, because it is a saving of £2 or £3 million. But the flip side of that is you've got to look at how much football has expanded over recent years. So football has expanded as revenues have expanded. And when I say expanded, I mean, so for example, in 2014, Arsenal had 539 full-time employees. At the end of 2019, they had 707 full-time employees. So that's quite a difference. Everton, for example, had 247 employees in 2014, and now have got 456, or at the last accounts, they had 456. So the activities of the clubs themselves have expanded. Well, one assumes that they have, unless they've become more sort of less efficient. The activities of the clubs have expanded, and therefore they've taken on more people, and that's a natural result of increased income coming into the business. every business, when they face a 15, 20% perhaps reduction in turnover, looks to reduce costs, and it is an unfortunate fact of life that one of the easiest costs for any business to reduce and have an immediate effect on cash flow, if cash flow is an issue, is your people cost, is your employment cost.
Mm-hmm.
So it is it's like the first port of call that you go to in a business that has reduced income. How can we save money? Well, we can stop doing certain activities, which will help us save money, obviously. Well, then if we stop doing those activities, can we redeploy those people to perhaps more productive jobs within the business?
Yeah.
That's possible in manufacturing businesses and service businesses, retail and stuff like that. I think it would be very difficult to do in football because it just is. I think the other point is that if you look at some of the people that have been or are to be made redundant by Arsenal, there's clearly a very big change in their business model. So quite a few of the people that will be going are related to recruitment. And it seems to me that Arsenal are going away from what has always been a very successful area for them in terms of having quite a large recruitment division and bringing players through, which is what they've done historically, to like an outsourced model, which is almost like what Everton have in terms of using people like Kia Jorabachian, and that's part of the changes as well, I think. So I think I'm not surprised that it's happened. I can understand why it's happened. I think it's been handled very badly, and I think the timing of it's very, very poor. But it's going to be repeated up and down the country. Arsenal tend to make hard business decisions before other clubs do, and that's usually evidenced by their financial success, and the fact that they've had more than £100 million in the bank for years on end is evidence that they run a pretty tight ship. Now that Arsenal have done it, even though they've done it in a ham-fisted sort of way, don't be surprised that that's not repeated up and down the country from other Premier League clubs, Everton included. I've got no knowledge of that with regards to Everton before anybody sort of queries that. But I'm just saying it's an inevitable consequence of when a business loses income. It has to look at its cost base, and the easiest way of reducing costs is normally to relieve people of their roles.
Yeah, I think that's a rational prediction with, as I say, adequate evidence to back that up, and to watch the change of business models over time. For me in particular, I think that will be something that will be extremely interesting. Something that I've pretty much studied over the last 3 years as part of my university degree is the commercial investment within the sector. Over the past several years, for example, the broadcasting monies from Sky and elsewhere, and other significant changes, which is developed all these other industries that operate in and around football. Obviously, again, to touch on it again, you say you don't like football as much as you used to. What have been the biggest changes that you've seen within the industry during your time of watching it? Because I'm just using one example, if I'm not wrong, I think, for example, shirt sponsors weren't allowed until the late 70s.
Yeah. When I first started watching it, there was it was a simple shirt, and the 1969-70 side didn't even have the badge on the front of the shirt. So, what's I think the biggest change in football is the change in power base from the clubs to the players. That's the biggest single change in football in sort of 50 years of watching football, and as a result of that, clubs have had to respond. In the past, clubs effectively determined what their expenditure was by controlling wages, and wages have always been the largest single element of playing football. Paying players has always been the biggest element of expenditure in playing professional football. I think actually there's two things. I think when Tottenham decided in the late 1980s that they were going to throw out the Football League rules. So there was a rule called Rule 34, which very much restricted what clubs could invest in, what other clubs could pay dividends, the fact that they had a social responsibility to the community. Tottenham went to the Football League as it was then and asked whether or not they could set up a holding company. They could set up a holding company above the football club. And the Football League didn't understand the consequences of that, because once they did that, all of the previous rules that existed in terms of financial restrictions on football clubs disappeared. And effectively, that opened the door to fresh capital coming in. And the moment the fresh capital comes into a business, so in the moment an investor comes in that isn't a footballer comes in, obviously the whole dynamics change, because they're then looking for a financial return.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually, if I really think about it, that's ultimately the point that football changed. Capital came in, football started to expand, and as it expanded, its costs expanded initially much more quickly than its revenues. Because in the early days before the Premier League, the broadcasting revenues were very small. In fact, even at the beginning of the Premier League, the broadcasting revenues were very small, and the revenues took a long time to catch up with the increase in expenditure, which is actually one of the reasons why financial fair play came in, because those clubs that couldn't get investors to invest capital started to borrow money, and in the late sort of between sort of 2000, actually after the financial crash of 2008, there was a lot of concern that a lot of clubs would go bust, which is ultimately why financial fair play came in. But I think you can drive it back to Tottenham's decision to put a holding company above their club, which allowed capital to come into the game, fresh capital to come into the game, which then created this environment where everybody was playing leapfrog. So there was massive wage inflation for players, and as a result of that, they then had to start to try and generate income to support those costs, which meant sponsorship, which meant increasing admission prices across grounds. It meant the sort of gentrification of football.
Mm-hmm.
And Manchester United are a classic example of that. The so-called prawn sandwich brigade.
Yeah.
That all of those elements became much more important to football clubs than as you say, the community, the core, the base support, the guys that like my granddad, and like thousands of others, millions of others, who just stood on the terraces week in, week out. Those people became so much less important to the game.
It's a terrible shame in my opinion. But what I wanted to ask, something you touched on, a power change almost to the ball being in the court of the players.
Yeah.
And something from my generation, obviously, in all fairness, I will go as far to say I much more enjoyed football of the mid 2000s. For example, my favorite player of all time, and a player that made me absolutely fall in love with football, was Ronaldinho.
Mm-hmm.
He was obviously, the commercial activity of the man, for his relationship with the like of Nike and his own offshoot brand R10 that he had. He was a real sort of trendsetter in that sense. But now I feel like in the social media generation, as it were, I just wanted to be interested to hear your take on it. What do you feel the impact of the social media generation of players are? Do you think that favours the power of the player?
Yeah, it actually does, but most players don't use it very well. And I think it's a real. I think to be honest, it's a real issue in the game, and I'm surprised that some football clubs, at least, because some football clubs are good businesses and have proper processes. I'm surprised there's not more control over social media activity by the players. And an example of that would have been this week with Iwobi.
Iwobi, yeah.
Yeah, he's a young man. He's earning a lot of money, and he's perfectly entitled to do whatever he likes with that money. I think everybody would accept that. But why didn't somebody, either the football club or when he was a much younger man, sit down and say, with I'm a great believer that with privilege, because the privilege offers you many things which are beneficial to you as an individual and your family, but it also brings further and greater responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you are privileged, you have to use that privilege responsibly. And so, why doesn't a football club, or why when somebody's going through an academy, why don't you teach young footballers that it's not, if you want to be a celebrity when your career is finished. If you want to show a load of bling, make that bling the medals that you've won, not the buckles on your shoes or the diamonds on your watch.
100%.
The only bit of silver you should see from a footballer is the silverware that they've won. And I don't understand why clubs don't take control of individual players' social media channels or accounts, and just make it a condition of employment and say, look, I'm sorry, if you're going to work for us as a footballer, it's great. You can do whatever the hell you like in your free time, subject to the normal conditions in terms of keeping yourself fit and stuff. But we control your social media activities because we think it's very important that you're presented in the right way, because if you do it yourself and you get it wrong, it reflects badly on you, and it equally reflects badly on the club. But again, I think that's just an example of poor management that exists across the business.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, from my university experiences, both good and bad, I feel like personally that would be a business interest of myself, even if it's an external organization that has to help out with, as you say, it's almost the PR of the player and their social media management. And as you say, as long as that's done accordingly and appropriately, I feel like an organization such as that would really go a long way. And I think that's a great point to touch on to bring us to Everton as a whole, because I've spent quite a fair bit of time articulating what exactly I thought of the whole saga surrounding Alex Iwobi. I think my thoughts are well documented on him as a player. I don't think the business was particularly savvy on part of Everton Football Club. I think his player profile doesn't quite fit into what we need. But what I think my conclusions from this social media issue is that the culture of Arsenal Football Club and the culture of Everton Football Club are entirely different. Obviously, the mantra of the People's Club has always rang true to Everton Football Club, and obviously under David Moyes, we could have been characterised by our industriousness, our hard working, and our unity as a team, which often reflected to, as you say, the supporters on the terraces. And I think, as I say, this brings us nicely into the Everton discussion to round the podcast. What are Everton's ambitions and purpose of a football club now, Paul? Because obviously I was raised on these stories of the 80s and the 60s before that. Obviously, as you know, the fantastic Dixie Dean. We've always been a leading organisation within football and a winning organisation at that. We've got a terrific history that we should always be proud of, no matter what happens in the modern day. But now, obviously, we're coming off the back of a 12th place finish, which is simply just unacceptable. Are we now just resigned to shouldering the social responsibility of, we've always been fantastic with our PR, I feel. We've always been, I think that's exemplified through, the campaigns that the club run through lockdown, looking after supporters and reaching out. And you can obviously point to Everton in the community and what they've done over the last 30 or so years as well. But obviously, in the short term, we need measurable goals, obviously, to improve our performance on the pitch. Recruitment as well, I think, is a huge one. As that, I think Phil McNulty pointed at that definitely in one of your recent podcasts. But what can we do looking towards the medium and the long term to transform back to that winning organisation that we once were? Or, as I say, is that just unattainable now?
It's certainly much more difficult than it used to be, but it is attainable. And I think what you've got to do, if you're the owner of the business and your absolute ambition is to become the best in the business, is you have to do everything better than everybody else does. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a genuine commitment from the top to do everything better than everybody else does, to have people who are not necessarily any more hardworking than anybody else, because I think most people who work in most football clubs are probably hardworking, or not even necessarily even more intelligent than anybody else. You just have to have that commitment to being the best. So whatever your role is in the organisation, be it you're the chairman, be it you're the CEO, be it you're responsible for ticketing on a Saturday, whatever, it doesn't matter. Whether you're painting the lines on the pitch, that is done to the very best of your abilities, mm-hmm. and hopefully those abilities are sufficient to meet the standards of the club. If they're not sufficient to meet the standards of the club, then you either look to train people or you look to replace people. And I think that's where you have to start. Nobody can. I think nobody can legitimately deny Moshiri's desire for Everton to succeed, as witnessed by the amount of money that he's put into the club, and as witnessed by some of the comments that he's made in terms of we're not a museum, we have a short window of opportunity, blah blah blah. But what the big difficulty is that there's been no execution of that, and he hasn't provided the leadership to make sure that the things that need doing have been done. His solution has just been to provide lots of money, mm-hmm. in the belief that the people within the organisation were sufficiently skilled, sufficiently motivated, sufficiently experienced to become better than everybody else. And I say this every time I say it. This is not a personal comment about any individual or anything else. The sad fact is that the majority of the people that we have working for the club, and particularly the leadership, aren't strong enough, experienced enough, or skilled enough to be the best in the business, because there are other clubs doing the same things much better than we are. Mm-hmm. And the evidence, and people say, the evidence of that is very much, if you look at where are we relative to our peers. Well, when David Moyes left the club, we were still very much the best of the rest. Yeah. And the rest at that time was 16 clubs. There were 4, the Sky 4, and then there was 16, and we were the best of those 16. I think when Martinez left the club and Moshiri came in, that 4 had become 6, because Manchester City and Tottenham had sort of moved up into that sort of upper echelon. But we were still the best of the remaining 14. Now nobody's got into that 6. The 6 are the same as they were 4.5 years ago when Moshiri arrived. Yeah. The problem that we have is that there are clubs that are now above us in terms of whoever the rest are. So the 14 clubs that are in the Premier League, we are no longer by any measure the best of the rest. Examples would be Leicester City, Wolverhampton Wanderers, where they've been blessed as we've been blessed in terms of having owners that come in and are prepared to invest in the club. Moshiri's actually invested much more the Wolves owners or indeed the Leicester owners have. But they've executed and used that funding much better than we have.
Yeah.
And until we address the reasons why the amount of money that's been put into the club, why we've made such disastrous recruitment in terms of managers, up to obviously very recent times in terms of Ancelotti, until those issues are addressed, then we're just destined to keep repeating the mistakes. I think we will improve as a football club by virtue of having Ancelotti, just because he's very good and he's very experienced and he's one of the best in the business. So he will bring some improvement even to the existing squad. I don't doubt that. The issue is whether that degree of improvement by itself is enough to get us advancing up the league rather than sliding down the league. My fear is that there are other clubs improving more quickly than we are. So if they're ahead of us, the gap is getting bigger. If they're behind us, so like a Southampton, for example, the gap is getting smaller. And unless we address the club in its entirety and have this commitment to being excellent at everything that we do, genuinely excellent, not in terms of our own definition of excellence, but in terms of a definition of excellence that looks at our peer groups, and we analyze ourselves against our peers against sort of internal measures. Unless we do that, we're relying upon chance, and it becomes a roll of the dice. And why nobody invests in something that's unless you want to go to a casino, nobody invests in anything that's just a roll of a dice.
True, very true. And I mean, comes back to the motto of the football club, right? Nosatis nisi optimum. I mean, we should most certainly aspire to live up to that, I would feel.
But that's the most. I love our motto, but it's the most difficult thing in the world to live up to.
Very true. Very true.
And in a sense, we've allowed our club motto to disappear. So we've substituted it for the People's Club. Now, the People's Club could be an extension of the motto, because we could actually be the very best People's Club that there is. But we have to be the very best at everything we do first, rather than becoming the People Club and then looking to sort of reverse that process. So I think the people that we've got in the organisation, and it starts with the shareholder, definitely the chairman and the board members, is that the realization is that they can't live up to the standards that the motto requires. And that's why we've had all of this sort of almost distraction techniques in terms of the People Club, in terms of the charity, in terms of the excellent work that we do, when actually what needs addressing is what happens in the football club, and how does the football club stand up to the motto.
Yeah, and in all honesty, I feel the People's Club motto should have been left behind with David Moyes, considering he was the one that brandished us with it. To David Moyes' credit, in all honesty, I wouldn't say a bad thing about him, considering the rut that he got us out of from the 90s, but the fashion in which he left the club, I do feel like the People's Club should have been left behind with that. Something that I did want to touch on, Paul, you talked about the likes of Wolves there and their efficiency with the funds that they have. The introduction of financial fair play has certainly stalled project clubs such as ourselves. I would say, you can no longer abide by the scattergun policy that landed Manchester City in the fantastic position that they are today. The rule that they would not be banned from European football come out recently, and there's announcements of new ruling in regards to financial fair play. I was just hoping to get your understanding of that and what the potential impacts could be for the upcoming seasons.
I'm going to say something that's pretty controversial. I think people have to look at where would we be without financial fair play, and yes, definitely it's the fact that financial fair play makes it very difficult for a challenging club to break into sort of, the very top of the game. But let's just imagine a scenario for a second where financial fair play didn't exist. How much more bigger would the bigger clubs be? Because the bigger clubs have the same restrictions as the smaller clubs do.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a question of scale. So if you've got more revenue, you can do more things with it. State-owned clubs like PSG and Manchester City, they're already at a point where they make the rest of the league, their respective leagues, almost uncompetitive. Liverpool would argue that clearly they've broken through that.
Yeah.
But had there not been restrictions placed on Manchester City, PSG, Barcelona, probably certainly Bayern Munich because of the big corporate backers that they have, I would argue that the leagues would be even more uncompetitive than they are now.
Okay.
And I don't think many people in football say that, but that would be my belief. Because if there's absolutely no limit to the amount of money that you can put into the game, then you can. It doesn't matter how wealthy Mashiri is. Manchester City are always going to spend more money. Abramovich would have spent much more money than he did. That's the difficulty. How do we? What do we do going forward? I think the rules need to be better constructed. So the actual drafting of the rules is poor, which is why clubs work very hard at getting around them. And then when a club is actually found to have been in breach of the very poor rules that exist, the processes by which UEFA have gone through in order to prosecute the clubs has been very poorly executed as well. So a very wealthy club like Manchester City that can access the world's best lawyers and barristers are always going to have a fighting chance of overcoming any ruling that's made, because there's always gaps in the regulation. Or in any regulated business, the businesses themselves are always better at doing things than the regulators. The regulators are, in any regulated business, are always miles behind the participants in that industry. I mean, that's just the fact of life, because if you want to recruit the best people don't actually work for regulators. They work for the participants, because they actually, it's whether are you if you want to be the best, you want to work for Manchester City. You don't want to work for UEFA. So that's the difficulty. The UEFA and the Premier League, that they have to become better at doing what they do, or what they're supposed to do, which is regulating the business, particularly in days like today, where very, very smart people can join football clubs because they can afford to pay them competitive salaries. One of the other things, for example, about Arsenal is in recent weeks they've brought somebody onto the board who's a major City lawyer. That doesn't come cheap.
Yeah.
But it puts them at a massive advantage compared to UEFA or the Premier League, who wouldn't have a person of that quality either on their board or as one of their advisors.
Yeah, that's a fair shout, and it casts me back to some of the studies I did for my dissertation. Really, one point being that the activities and the behaviour of governing bodies, and as you say, the regulations certainly need to be improved. And I think case in point being the relegation of Wigan Athletic recently to League One. Another point being, it called me back to my podcast with Daniel G, the sports lawyer, who said there's been a huge increase of different articulate and savvy investors from different industries that have cast eyes on the football industry and emerged through it in the form of executives and decision makers. So yeah, again, I think that really emphasizes your point that the best work for the participants. To finish up the podcast now, Paul, when the money for Everton Football, as you said, with Everton Football Club for a long time, the hope was, when will we get the money? The money's come in, and as you've explained throughout this podcast, the decision making that's accompanied that has been awry, and I think a lot of eyes now are cast to Bramley-Moore Dock as the light at the end of the tunnel for the commercial development and enhancement of the football club. Do you think the move to Bramley-Moore Dock is going to deliver this prosperous future that we all hoped that Everton would achieve?
I'm going to sound like Dr. Gloom today. Let me put it this way. It should do. Right? The evidence of other clubs moving to other stadia or new stadia rather, is generally positive. So, there's, if you want to look at like from an academic point of view, there's clearly plenty of evidence for that. The issue for me is, first of all, will it happen in the time frame that they say it's going to happen? Because I think the economic impact of COVID-19 is so great that what looked like an eminently sensible thing 12 months ago, to build a stadium predominantly funded by debt, the business case was pretty clear to do it. I'm not sure the business case is quite so clear at this particular moment in time. So it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if there wasn't a delay post getting planning permission, if there wasn't a delay in the process whilst it was reevaluated. And that reevaluation will be going on amongst the potential investors, because they will be looking at what is the economic impact on, because most of them, I believe, are overseas, US high net worth investors. How does the UK stack up, first of all, globally in economic terms? Probably not very good. How does Liverpool stack up in the UK economy? Again, it's very difficult to present a positive case for Liverpool based on how the economy has grown in Liverpool over the last 10 years. The sectors that where Liverpool have grown are the sectors that are most heavily hit by COVID-19. So the background, the macroeconomic picture has changed enormously. So that does put a question mark over it. The positive is if you can get over that hurdle, and if you can find backers, and if Moshiri is prepared to put the money in that's needed to be put in, even after he's found the backers, is that yes, it will improve things. How much it will improve things are down to two factors: one, the economy, and two, how well it's executed by the club, which takes us back to the issue that, as I said before, we've had good fortune, but we've just not executed it well. We need to make changes in order to execute it well.
Fair point. Very fair point. Paul, I just want to say it's been fantastic to have a long form discussion with you. I'm really glad that we finally got round to recording the podcast together, and fingers crossed the future's a bit brighter for Everton Football Club than what it seems to be today. And in regards to the podcast, you're more than welcome to come on in the future to discuss any matters in and around football.
Thank you. I've said a lot of quite harsh things in this, and I think much of your leadership might expect it from me, because that sort of tends to be my reputation. We've still got to have hope, and we've still got to have belief. And I think in both Brands and Ancelotti, we've got the best that we could have in terms of the positions that they hold. So I think we have to hang on to that and say that no matter what happens within the club, those two guys will produce the best results that's possible in the circumstances. What we need, though, is to increase that sort of that little centre of excellence that we have there in terms of director of football and the manager, and extend that across the business so that actually every part of the business has its own Angelotti, has its own Marcel brands. When we do that, that's when we'll really see progress.
Most definitely. I would echo that. Paul, thanks very much for your time. The Esk, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.